A millionaire arrives at a restaurant to collect overdue rent from the establishment and encounters a shocking scene. A 7-year-old girl with a broken arm cleans the soaked floor with one hand while crying in pain. When the magnate questions why this is happening, he discovers that this child is working in inhumane conditions to pay for her grandmother's critical treatment. So, what the millionaire does next leaves everyone completely shocked. The rain drummed against the armored glass of the black Mercedes-Benz, creating a hypnotic rhythm Edward Price knew well. 43 years old, with perfectly combed graying hair and an impeccable Italian suit, he drove through the wet streets with the precision of a man who had turned efficiency into an art form. His fingers, adorned with a Swiss watch that cost more than a small apartment, tapped on the leather steering wheel as his cold eyes mentally calculated figures. 2 months of overdue rent, $3,200 that should have been in his bank account, but remained in the hands of irresponsible tenants. Edward sighed, adjusting the rearview mirror to check his impeccable appearance. First rule of business: always look more prosperous than your debtors. Psychological intimidation worked better than any lawyer. The small restaurant, the corner diner, emerged through the curtain of rain like a faded patch between taller buildings. A peeling facade, a sign with burnt-out bulbs, windows fogged. From the steam inside, Edward frowned. Deteriorating properties meant devaluation, and devaluation meant loss. Perhaps it was time to increase the pressure for the tenants to vacate the premises. He parked on the sidewalk, completely ignoring the yellow curb. Parking tickets were just numbers on his spreadsheets, irrelevant compared to the millions he moved monthly. He opened his Italian umbrella and walked to the glass door, where a faded sticker announced "Open" in letters that had once been red. The bell over the door jingled as Edward entered, shaking raindrops from his coat. The aroma of simmering stew and baking bread should have been inviting, but to him it smelled like lost revenue. His companies owned dozens of similar properties scattered throughout the city, all generating steady income, all maintained at minimum operational standards. It was then that his eyes fixed on something that made his brain short-circuit for a full few seconds. On the restaurant's damp floor, between scratched Formica tables and stacked plastic chairs, a girl of about 7 was on her knees. Her brown hair stuck to her face, wet with sweat and tears, while her one available hand scrubbed the floor with a dirty rag. Her right arm hung limply at her side, wrapped in homemade bandages, already yellowing at the edges. Edward felt something strange constrict in his chest. In decades of business, he had seen desperate families, pleading tenants, situations of extreme poverty. But he had always managed to maintain emotional distance, treating each case as numbers in reports. This image, however, pierced his defenses like a sharp blade. The girl hadn't noticed him. She continued scrubbing the floor with mechanical movements, like a little robot programmed for a single task. Silent tears streamed down her rosy cheeks, dripping onto the floor she herself was cleaning. The contrast between her fragility and the desperate determination in her gestures created a disturbing scene. "Can I help you?" A hoarse voice echoed from the back of the establishment. Edward looked up, but couldn't completely divert his attention from the child. Something fundamental had broken within him at that moment, a crack in walls he'd spent decades building. And as the rain continued to beat against the fogged windows, he sensed that his life would never be the same. Joseph Joe Miller emerged from the back of the restaurant like a shadow hunched by the weight of years and worries. 60-something, an apron stained with grease and tomato sauce, disheveled gray hair, and the tired gaze of someone who worked 16 hours a day just to keep the bills paid. His hands trembled slightly when he recognized the man standing at the entrance. Mr. Price. The voice came out more like a resigned whisper than a greeting. I was expecting your visit." Edward adjusted his shirt cuff, an automatic gesture he made when he needed to reassume his role as a ruthless businessman, but his eyes kept drifting to the girl, who had now stopped cleaning and was watching him with a child's curiosity mixed with fear. She clutched the dirty rag to her chest, as if it were a protective shield. "2 months, Joe." Edward's voice sounded softer than usual, a change he himself noted with strangeness. $3,200. You know I can't let this continue." The restaurant owner lowered his head, his nervous hands fidgeting with the apron strings. "I know, sir. I know you've been patient, more than you should have. It's just, things are very tough. Business slowed down with this construction on the street, and I had to lay off staff." "And her?" Edward interrupted, discreetly pointing to the girl. "Is she one of your employees?" Joe followed the businessman's gaze, and his face contorted in discomfort. The girl, realizing she had become the center of the conversation, tried to hide behind a table, but her injured arm made her whimper softly in pain. "No, sir, this is Sophia, Maria's daughter. Maria was my cook until last week, but I had to, well, she was missing a lot of work." Joe rubbed his face with his calloused hands. "The girl's mother is taking care of her sick grandmother, who's in the hospital in critical condition. They have nowhere to go, so I let them work here in exchange for food and a place to sleep in the back." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Work? She's 7 years old." 6, actually. The correction came in a voice as fragile as crystal. Sophia had approached timidly, her large dark eyes fixed on the businessman's face. "I'll be 6 next month. Mummy said if I help a lot, Grandma will get better soon." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. Edward looked at the child, really looked, not just saw, and noticed details his business mind had catalogued, but not emotionally processed. The clean but mended clothes, the worn but lovingly polished shoes, the upright posture, despite the obvious pain in her arm. "What happened to your arm, Sophia?" "Arm?" Edward crouched to be at the girl's eye level, surprising both himself and Joe. "I fell off the ladder when I was cleaning the high windows," she answered with the disturbing naturalness of a child accustomed to suffering. "But it doesn't hurt much. Mommy made a really nice bandage, look." She tried to lift her arm to show him, but the pain made her hesitate. Edward stood up abruptly, a wave of anger surging from nowhere. "Ladder? She was cleaning windows on a ladder?" Joe instinctively recoiled. "Sir, her mother was with me in the kitchen. The girl wanted to help, said she could reach. A 6-year-old child shouldn't be working, much less doing dangerous tasks." Edward's voice echoed through the empty restaurant. Sophia began to cry silently, and something inside the businessman shattered completely. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the back of the restaurant, followed by the creak of a poorly fitted door. Maria Miller appeared, carrying a torn plastic bag, her face marked by exhaustion. 32 years old that looked like 40, black hair tied in a messy bun, simple but clean clothes, and eyes that carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Sophia, honey, you shouldn't be... You..." She stopped abruptly upon noticing Edward, her words dying in her throat. The recognition was immediate, not of the man himself, but of what he represented. Expensive suit, imposing posture, the intimidating presence of someone who held power over their lives. "Mommy!" Sophia ran to her mother, her good arm outstretched, seeking familiar comfort. Maria hugged her instinctively, but her eyes remained fixed on the businessman, a mixture of fear and defiance shining in her dark pupils. "Miss Miller, I presume?" Edward softened his tone, realizing how his presence had altered the atmosphere. "I'm Edward Price, owner of the property." Maria swallowed hard. "Mr. Price, I was at the hospital. My mother..." Her voice failed, and she pulled Sophia closer, as if the girl could be a shield against the inevitable. Joe told me about the situation. Edward looked around the restaurant, noticing for the first time details he had ignored on previous visits. The floor was spotless, despite the precarious conditions, the tables arranged with military precision, a desperate order imposed on chaos. Your daughter was cleaning the floor when I arrived. Sophia, you promised you'd rest. Maria knelt beside, the girl carefully checking the bandaged arm. Your little arm still hurts, but Grandma needs her medicine, and Mr. Joe said if we work hard, he'll give us money to buy it. Sophia spoke with the cruel logic of a child forced to grow up too soon. Edward felt that crack in his chest widen. What kind of medicine? Maria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing personal matters with a stranger, especially one who could evict them at any moment. My mother had a stroke 3 weeks ago. She's in the public hospital, but she needs specific medications that Medicaid doesn't fully cover. Without them, her voice broke. How much does the treatment cost? The direct question caught Maria off guard. She looked at Joe, who was watching the conversation with growing nervousness, then back at Edward. Why do you want to know? Answer, please. $160 a week, just for the medication. That's not counting the extra tests she'll need. Maria hugged Sophia tighter. I work nights cleaning offices, but it's not enough. That's why I agreed to work here during the day too, in exchange for a place to stay with Sophia. Edward quickly did the math. $160 was less than the value of his tie. For him, it was an insignificant amount. For them, it meant the difference between life and death. And Sophia's father? Died 2 years ago. Workplace accident. The answer came dry, sharp, ending that line of questioning. The businessman watched mother and daughter embraced, two fragile figures facing storms that would be beyond the capacity of most adults. Sophia had rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her eyes closing from exhaustion, but still firmly clutching the cleaning rag. Why was Sophia on the ladder? Edward directed the question to Joe, who had remained awkwardly silent. I asked Maria to clean the high windows before the health inspection next week, Joe muttered. The girl wanted to help, said she was small enough to reach the corners her mother couldn't. And you allowed it? Mr. Price, I need to keep this place running. If the health department finds me again, I'll have to close. Joe sounded desperate. They offered to help, and I needed the help. Edward looked around once more, now seeing not just a commercial establishment, but a fragile ecosystem of survival where each person desperately depended on the other. And at the center of it all, a 6-year-old girl with a broken arm cleaning floors to save her grandmother's life. Edward took his phone out of his pocket, a gesture that usually preceded a call to his lawyers or collectors. But this time, his hands hesitated over the screen. The numbers in his bank account danced in his mind, amounts that could solve all of this family's problems without him even feeling the financial impact. Mr. Price, Joe approached cautiously. About the rent, I know it's overdue, but if you give me 2 more weeks, I promise. It's not about the rent. Edward put the phone away, surprising everyone. Maria, I need you to take Sophia to the hospital now. Maria stiffened, pulling her daughter even closer. Why? What do you want with her? I want a doctor to examine. That arm! Not a homemade bandage, proper treatment. Edward took his wallet from his jacket. And I want to pay for your mother's medication. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Maria blinked several times, as if trying to process words that made no sense in her world of constant scarcity. I don't accept charity. The posed answer came firmly, but her voice trembled. It's not charity, it's... Edward paused, searching for the right words. In all his years of business, he had never needed to explain an act of kindness. It's a matter of responsibility. Responsibility. Maria stood up, keeping Sophia behind her. You have no responsibility towards us. You don't know us. You owe us nothing. Your daughter got hurt cleaning my property. She got hurt because I didn't know how to protect her better. The pain in Maria's voice was palpable. Because I'm a mother who lets her 6-year-old daughter work to get medicine for her grandmother. You're not to blame for that. Sophia watched the conversation with the unsettling seriousness of a child who understood more than she should. Mommy, if the man wants to help Grandma, why are you angry? Maria knelt in front of her daughter, holding her face with trembling hands. Because sometimes people help expecting something in return, my love, and we have nothing to give. Edward felt as if he'd been punched. Was this how the world saw him? A predator waiting to take advantage of others' vulnerability? The perception was painfully accurate considering his business history, but now it bothered him deeply. I expect nothing in return. He knelt too, bringing himself to their level. Maria, how old is your mother? 72. The answer came hesitantly. The same age my mother would be if she were still alive. Edward didn't know why he had shared that. She died 5 years ago, cancer. I paid for the best treatments, but there was nothing more to be done. Maria studied him with penetrating eyes, looking for signs of manipulation or falsehood. And why does that matter now? Because I could afford it. Because I had the resources to give her comfort in her last months, even knowing there was no cure. Edward looked at Sophia, who was distractedly playing with the bandage on her arm. Your mother still has a chance. There's treatment. And you're here arguing about pride while she... Don't tell me what to do. Maria stood up abruptly. You know nothing about our lives, about what we've been through? Then tell me. The simplicity of the answer disarmed Maria's anger. Explain to me why it's better for your daughter to clean floors with a broken arm than to accept medical help. Tears began to stream down Maria's face. Because when people like you help people like us, there's always a price, always, and that price is usually paid by those who can least afford it. Edward understood then that he wasn't just dealing with pride, but with years of exploitation and disappointment. Maria had learned to distrust kindness because it always came with strings attached. And if I sign a document, something that guarantees there are no conditions, no quid pro quo, Edward asked, a contract specifying it's a donation with no expectations. Joe, who had watched everything in silence, finally spoke. Maria, your mother doesn't have time for pride. Joe's words echoed through the restaurant like a funeral bell. Maria closed her eyes, her hands trembling. As she fought against years of self-preservation instincts, Sophia, sensing her mother's distress, approached and touched her leg with her good hand. Mummy, Grandma's going to get better, right? The childlike voice cut through Maria's emotional defenses like a blade. Edward watched mother and daughter, remembering conversations he'd had with his own mother during the last months of her life. She had refused expensive experimental treatments, claiming she had lived enough. He had spent a fortune anyway, buying hope with zeros on checks, but in the end, he had only managed to buy time. Maria, Edward spoke softly, his business voice replaced by something more human. What kind of person would I be if I could help and did nothing? The kind of person I've met my whole life. The answer came bitterly, laden with painful experiences. Bosses who promised decent wages and paid pennies. Doctors who guaranteed free treatment and then charged extra fees. Well-intentioned people who help today to collect favors tomorrow. Joe approached hesitantly. Maria, I'm sorry to interfere, but last night you were crying on the phone with the hospital. They said your mother only has a few days to start the new medication, or what? Edward asked, though he sensed the answer. Or the brain damage becomes irreversible. Maria said the words as if each one caused physical pain. She could be in a permanent vegetative state. The weight of the revelation fell upon everyone like a hammer. Edward mentally calculated a few days. There was no time for bureaucratic protocols, elaborate contracts, or lengthy negotiations. It was now or never. "Joe, do you have a pen and paper?" Edward assumed the commanding tone he used in business meetings. "Yes, sir." Joe hurried behind the counter, returning with a crumpled notepad and a blue pen. Edward began to write quickly, his business-like script filling the page. "I, Edward Price, SSN," he paused. "Maria, I need your full name." "Why are you doing this?" Maria asked, but there was something different in her voice now, a crack in the armor of mistrust. "Maria Miller Santos," Sophia answered for her mother, proud to know important information. Edward continued writing. "Commit to fully cover the medical treatment of Sophia Santos, 6 years old, including consultations, exams, and procedures necessary for the treatment of a fracture in her right arm. I also commit to covering the treatment of..." He looked at Maria, "Helen Santos, my mother. Helen Santos, 72 years old, including medications, exams, and procedures related to post-stroke treatment for as long as necessary. This donation is unconditional, with no quid pro quo or expectations of return. There are no hidden clauses, interest, or future commitments." Edward signed the document and handed it to Maria. "Read it. If you agree, sign as a witness." Maria took the paper with trembling hands, reading each word twice. Tears began to stream down her face, but she still hesitated. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would anyone do this for strangers?" Edward looked at Sophia, who was watching everything with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, he saw not the daughter of defaulting tenants, but a child who deserved to be 6 years old without carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Because sometimes the universe puts us in the right place to do the right thing," he said, surprising himself with the honesty of his own words. "And because your daughter reminded me that there's something more important than efficiency and profit." Maria signed the document with a trembling hand. "If this is some kind of trick..." "It's not." Edward put the paper in his inner jacket pocket. "Joe, can you stay with Sophia while we take Maria to the hospital to sort out her mother's treatment papers?" Sophia clung to her mother's skirt. "I want to go too. I want to see Grandma." "Your little arm needs to be examined too, sweetheart." Edward crouched again. "How about after the hospital, we go visit your grandmother?" The smile that lit up Sophia's face was the first time Edward felt he had done something truly important in his life. St. Teresa's private hospital was a completely different world from the public facilities Maria knew. Polished marble floors, pastel-toned walls, softly whispering air conditioning, and the aseptic smell mixed with discreet air fresheners. Sophia walked between her mother and Edward, her wide eyes absorbing every detail of the luxurious environment. "I've never seen such a beautiful hospital," Sophia murmured, her voice echoing in the wide corridor. Edward watched the girl discovering a world that was routine for him. How many times had he walked those corridors visiting partners, having executive checkups, or accompanying his own mother? Now, seeing through Sophia's eyes, he noticed details he had previously ignored, the stark contrast with the reality of most people. "Dr. Mendez will examine her now." The receptionist, an elegant middle-aged woman, smiled professionally. "It's in room 205, second door on the right." Maria hesitated at the door of the examination room. All her life, she had frequented overcrowded health clinics, waited hours in endless lines, received rushed attention from overworked professionals. The idea of a doctor dedicating exclusive time to her daughter seemed surreal. "You can go in. I'm not going to run away," Edward said with a half-smile, noticing her tension. Dr. Mendez was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and gentle hands that inspired immediate confidence. He knelt in front of Sophia, getting to her eye level before speaking. "Hello, Sophia. I'm Dr. Mendez. Can you tell me how you hurt your little arm?" Sophia looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I fell off the ladder when I was cleaning the windows at the diner. It hurt a lot, but Mommy made a bandage." The doctor carefully examined the arm, his facial expressions anxiously watched by Maria. Edward remained standing near the window, but his ears caught every word. "Maria, can I speak with you?" Dr. Mendez called after the initial examination. They moved a few steps away, but Edward could hear the whispered conversation. "The fracture is more serious than it looks. The bone is misaligned, and this homemade bandage, though made with care, isn't providing the necessary support." The doctor spoke gently but firmly. "If we don't correct this immediately, Sophia could have permanent limitations in her arm's movement." Maria brought her hand to her mouth, stifling an anguished gasp. "What kind of procedure will she need?" "A small surgery to realign the bone, followed by a few weeks in a proper cast. Nothing too invasive, but necessary." Dr. Mendez looked at Edward. "Mr. Price, I assume you'll authorize the procedure?" Edward nodded immediately. "Do whatever is necessary. When can we operate?" "Tomorrow morning, if you agree. I'll schedule everything for 7 o'clock. Sophia, who had remained seated on the examination table swinging her legs, caught everyone's attention. "Doctor, after you fix my arm, will I be able to help Grandma get better too?" The innocence of the question struck all the adults present. Dr. Mendez approached her again. "Sophia, did you know that the best medicine for sick people is the love of their family? Just by being near your grandmother, she'll already feel better. So can I visit her today?" Maria looked at Edward, who nodded. "Of course you can, sweetie." As they left the hospital, Edward made a quick call to his private driver. "Carlos, I need you to pick us up. We're going to City General Hospital." The difference between the two hospitals was shocking. From the pristine environment of St. Teresa's to the peeling walls, crowded corridors, and overflowing waiting rooms of the public hospital. Sophia held her mother's hand tightly as they navigated the crowd of people waiting for care. "Room 312, neurology wing," Maria murmured, guiding them through the maze of poorly lit corridors. When they finally reached the room, Edward saw Helen Santos for the first time. 72 years old, white hair spread on the pillow, pale skin contrasting with slightly bluish lips. Tubes and monitors surrounded the bed, creating an electronic orchestra of beeps and mechanical whispers. "Grandma!" Sophia ran to the bedside, her joy a stark contrast to the room's somber atmosphere. Helen slowly opened her eyes, and a faint smile lit her face when she saw her granddaughter. Helen held Sophia's small hand with trembling fingers, her eyes filling with tears as she saw her granddaughter's bandaged arm. Her voice came out hoarse, but laden with emotion. "My little warrior, how are you, my love?" "I'm fine, Grandma. Tomorrow a very nice doctor is going to fix my arm." Sophia leaned in to kiss her grandmother's face. "And Mommy said you're going to get better too." Edward remained near the door, feeling like an intruder in that intimate moment. But something in Helen's expression caught his attention. When the elderly woman looked at him, there was a flicker of recognition in her tired eyes. "You..." Helen tried to sit up in bed, her voice gaining unexpected strength. "You're a Price." Maria frowned, confused. "Mum, this is Mr. Edward. He's helping us with your treatment." "Price?" Helen repeated, her eyes fixed on the businessman. How old are you, young man? 43, ma'am. Edward slowly approached the bed. Then you must be Robert Price's son. The statement fell like a bomb in the quiet room. Edward felt his blood run cold. You knew my father? Helen tried to sit up straighter, and Maria helped her with pillows. Robert Price knew me very well. He bought our house 25 years ago. Mom, what are you talking about? Maria asked, confused. The house where you were born, Maria, where your father and I raised our family. Helen looked directly at Edward. The house your father bought for $10,000 when my husband was desperate to pay for my first heart surgery. Edward's world trembled beneath his feet. He vaguely remembered conversations he'd overheard as a teenager, when his father talked about investment opportunities in properties of financially distressed families. Mrs. Santos, Edward swallowed hard. The house was worth $160,000 back then, Helen continued, her voice gaining energy with resurgent anger. But my husband was desperate. I was dying, and the doctors said only private surgery. It could save me. Your father appeared like a saving angel, offering cash on the spot. Maria looked between her mother and Edward, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. Mom, you never told me this. Why tell you about the humiliation, about how we lost our home, our stability, our dignity? Helen turned to Edward. Your father resold our house 3 months later for $240,000, a profit of over $100,000 at the expense of our desperation. Edward felt nausea rising in his throat, memories of his privileged adolescence, the rapid expansion of the family business, the properties his father got for excellent prices began to make horrifying sense. That's why my daughter cleans floors, Helen pointed to Maria. That's why my granddaughter breaks her arm, helping the family survive. That's why I'm here in this bed, depending on the charity of strangers not to die. Sophia, who had listened to everything with the unsettling seriousness of an intelligent child, looked at Edward. Was your daddy mean to Grandma? The innocent question hit Edward like a punch to the gut. All his life, he had admired his father's business acumen, his ability to identify opportunities where others saw only human tragedies. Sophia, honey, come here, Maria called her daughter, trying to shield her from the growing tension. No, let her stay, Helen said firmly. It's important she understands how the world works. Edward backed away from the bed, his mind spiraling. Mrs. Santos, I didn't know. My father never told me the details. Of course he didn't. It's easier to sleep at night when you don't know the faces of the people you've destroyed. Helen closed her eyes for a moment. How many other families like ours, Edward? How many other homes, other lives? The question echoed in the silent room like a sentence. Edward realized he wasn't just facing a family in need. He was faced with the direct consequences of the business opportunities that had built his empire. Is that why you're helping us? Maria asked, her voice laced with a new, painful understanding. Guilt? Edward looked at Sophia, then at Maria. Finally, at Helen, 3 generations of strong women who had survived his family's destructive waves. Maybe it's the only chance I have to do something right, he whispered. The night was torture for Edward. Lying in his king-size bed in his penthouse apartment, he stared at the ornate ceiling as Helen's words echoed in his mind like a scratched record. For the first time in decades, the comfort of his wealth felt like a heavy burden on his chest. 5 in the morning found him still awake, sifting through dusty files in his private home office. Old company documents, contracts signed by his father, financial reports from the 90s. Each page he turned revealed more details of a pattern he had preferred to ignore. Purchases at ridiculously low prices of properties from desperate families, Quick resales with exorbitant profits. The phone rang at 6:30. Dr. Mendez confirming Sophia was being prepped for surgery. "I'll be there in an hour," Edward said, already putting on the suit he'd laid out in the early hours. At the hospital, he found Maria sitting in the surgical waiting room, her hands clasped in silent prayer. She had spent the night there, refusing Edward's offer to pay for a hotel. Her red, tired eyes contrasted with the steely determination in her posture. How was she when she went in? Edward sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Brave, told me not to worry because the nice doctor was going to make her good as new." Maria smiled sadly. "She's always been strong like that. Had to be." They remained silent for a few minutes, the weight of the previous night's revelation hanging between them like a storm cloud. "My mother didn't say that to hurt you," Maria said finally. She's carried that pain for so long. Seeing a price helping our family must have brought it all back." She had every right to say it. Edward looked out the wide windows of the waiting room. "I've spent my whole life benefiting from decisions my father made without ever questioning how he achieved so much success so quickly. You were a child when that happened, but I wasn't a child when I took over the business. I wasn't a child when I continued using the same methods." Edward turned to her. "Maria, how many properties do you think my company owns?" "I don't know. Many. 243 commercial and residential properties, and now I wonder how many stories like your family's are behind each deed." He ran his hands through his hair. "How many other Sophias are out there paying for the sins I helped perpetuate?" Dr. Mendez appeared at the door, still in surgical scrubs. They both stood up immediately. "The surgery was a complete success," he smiled. "Sophia handled it like a champ. The bone is perfectly aligned now, and she should have a full recovery of movement." Maria wept with relief, and Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Can I see her?" "She'll be awake in an hour, but there's one more thing." Dr. Mendez hesitated. "During the pre-op exams, we discovered Sophia has severe anemia, probably a result of prolonged malnutrition." Edward's relief turned to renewed concern. "Is it serious?" "Treatable with vitamin supplements and proper nutrition, but it indicates she hasn't been getting enough nourishment for quite some time." Maria lowered her head, guilt etched on her face. "I do what I can. Sometimes she shares her food with other kids in the neighborhood who are going hungry." Edward closed his eyes. A 6-year-old child distributing her own food because she saw need around her. Meanwhile, he dined in restaurants where a single meal cost more than Maria's monthly salary. "Dr. Mendez, besides treatment for anemia, what other care will Sophia need?" "Nutritional follow-up, vitamins, some physical therapy sessions for her arm. Nothing too complex, but essential. Do everything, absolutely everything necessary." After the doctor left, Maria turned to Edward. "Why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's guilt. There's something more." Edward thought of Sophia asking if his father had been mean, of Helen recounting the lost house, of Maria working 3 jobs to support 3 generations. "Because for the first time in my life I have the chance to use my money for something that truly matters," he said honestly. "And because Sophia reminded me that there are things more valuable than business efficiency." Sophia woke from anesthesia with a sleepy smile, and the first question she asked was about her grandmother. The colorful cast on her right arm was decorated with flower drawings a nurse had made, and she observed it with childlike fascination. "Can I draw too when I get home?" Sophia asked, trying to wiggle the fingers peeking out from the cast. "Of course you can, sweetie." Maria kissed the girl's forehead. "When we get home." The word home echoed strangely in the air. Edward realized that technically they didn't have a home. just a corner in the back of Joe's diner. The irony was bitter. The family had lost their real home to his father and now lived on charity in a property he himself owned. "Maria, I need to talk to you about something." Edward waited for Sophia to fall asleep again before continuing. "About housing. We're not going to be evicted, are we?" The instant fear in Maria's voice hit him like a slap. "No, that's not it. It's the opposite." Edward pulled a chair closer to the hospital bed. "I have several vacant residential properties, apartments in safe neighborhoods near schools and health clinics. You could—" "No." The answer was immediate and firm. "We're not accepting any more charity." "It wouldn't be charity, it would be—" Edward searched for the right words. "It would be justice, an attempt to repair what my family destroyed." Maria looked at Sophia sleeping, then back at Edward. "And when you get tired of playing the good guy, when you decide you've done enough to ease your conscience, where will we live then?" The question was valid and painful. Edward didn't have an answer that sounded convincing because he himself didn't know how long this transformation he felt happening within him would last. "I understand your mistrust," he said finally. "But what if we make a regular rental agreement? You'd pay a symbolic amount, have tenant rights, legal stability. With what money? My cleaning ewages barely cover food and Mum's medicine." Edward had thought about this during his sleepless night. "I could offer you a job, something related to property management, since you understand the needs of tenants in difficult situations." Maria laughed humorlessly. "A job? I barely finished high school. What kind of management could I do?" "The kind I've never managed to do well." Edward leaned forward. "The kind that sees people behind the numbers, that understands when someone is late with rent due to real need, not irresponsibility." Before Maria could answer, the room door opened and Dr. Mendez entered with a worried expression. "Edward, I need to speak with you urgently." They stepped out into the hallway, leaving Maria with Sophia. Dr. Mendez seemed uneasy, his nervous hands fidgeting with his stethoscope. "What happened?" Edward asked. "I received a strange call a little while ago, someone asking about the costs of Sophia's treatment, wanting to know who was paying the bills." Dr. Mendez lowered his voice. "The person identified themselves as legal counsel and said there were suspicions of irregularities in the financing." Edward felt a chill down his spine. "What kind of legal counsel?" "They wouldn't fully identify themselves, but they mentioned investigations into misuse of corporate funds." Dr. Mendez looked around before continuing. "Edward, someone is investigating you." The realization hit Edward like a thunderbolt. His partners, his board of directors, perhaps even his own lawyers were monitoring his recent spending. The money he had used to help Sophia and Helen wasn't technically his personal income. It came from business accounts he controlled, but which were corporate property. "There's more," Dr. Mendez continued. "The person asked specifically about the relationship between you and the Santos family, as if they knew something." Edward leaned against the hallway wall, feeling the weight of decades of calculated business decisions coming back to haunt him. He had built an empire based on ruthless efficiency and mutual distrust. Now, as he tried to do something human and decent, those same tools were being used against him. "Dr. Mendez, is Sophia's and Helen's treatment secure, regardless of what happens to me?" "It is. But Edward," the doctor hesitated, "if there are legal issues involved, maybe you should reconsider your level of involvement with this family." Edward looked through the glass door of the room, where Sophia had woken up and was excitedly telling Maria something, gesturing with her casted arm. "No," he said with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm not reconsidering anything." Edward had barely arrived at his office the next morning when his secretary intercepted him with a tense expression. "Mr. Price, the board of directors has requested an emergency meeting for 9 o'clock. All members will be present." The formal tone and the scheduled time left no doubt. It wasn't an invitation, but a summons. Edward went up to the 32nd floor, where the panoramic meeting room offered an impressive view of the city he had helped shape through his real estate investments. 5 men in dark suits were already seated around the mahogany table when he entered. Faces he had known for decades, business partners who had built fortunes together, now watched him with the coldness of predators assessing wounded prey. Edward, Charles Fisher, chairman of the board, pointed to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Sit down." "Good morning to you too." Edward tried to keep his tone casual, but he could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. "Let's get straight to the point." Fisher opened a folder full of documents. "Over the past 3 days, you've authorized expenditures of $43,000 for medical expenses unrelated to the company. Money that came out of Price Holdings' operational accounts." Edward showed no surprise. He had been expecting this since his conversation with Dr. Mendez. "That's correct." $43,000 spent on... Who was it again? Fisher consulted the papers. A family of delinquent tenants, a child and an elderly woman. People who, theoretically, you should be pressuring to pay overdue rent, not spoiling with expensive medical treatments. They needed urgent medical help. "And since when are we a charitable institution?" Robert Stone, another board member, leaned forward. "Edward, you've completely lost your sense of priorities. You're putting sentimentality above the company's interests." The company's interests include social responsibility. Social responsibility has its limits, Edward. Fisher tapped his fingers on the table. "And you've crossed all of them. Worse still, we've discovered that this family has a prior history with your family. This raises questions about your motives." Edward felt his blood run cold. "What history?" "Your father bought a property from this family 25 years ago. A perfectly legal business transaction, but one that apparently created resentment." Fisher smiled coldly. "Now you show up playing the saintly redeemer at the company's expense. It looks like emotional blackmail." "It's not blackmail. It's conscience." "Conscience doesn't pay dividends, Edward," Stone interjected. "And our investors are starting to question your emotional stability. 43,000 today, how much tomorrow? 100,000, 1,000,000. Are you investigating my personal life? We're protecting our investments." Fisher closed the folder. "Edward, you founded this company on principles of efficiency and profit. Now you're destroying those principles because of a child who got hurt cleaning a floor." The cruel description of Sophia made Edward stand up abruptly. "That child has a name, Sophia Santos, and she was cleaning a floor because our economic system forces desperate families into inhumane situations. Our economic system got us here." "Edward," Robert Stone pointed to the panoramic windows, "it gave us this view, these offices, these fortunes, and you want to destroy it all because of belated sentimentality?" "I want to use our fortune for something beyond accumulating more money." "Then use your personal fortune." Fisher stood up too. "But don't compromise the company's resources with your unauthorized philanthropic projects." Edward looked around the table, seeing faces he had considered friends reveal their true nature. "And if I refuse to stop, then we'll have to consider your removal from the CEO position of the company." Fisher's statement fell like a bombshell. "We have enough votes for that, Edward, and we have complete documentation of resource mismanagement. You're blackmailing me." "We're protecting our interests, just as you taught us to do over the years." Fisher smiled without warmth. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Edward understood then that he was facing the monster he himself had helped create. Decades of decisions based purely on profit, of business relationships with no room for humanity, of a corporate philosophy that treated people like numbers on spreadsheets. "You have 48 hours to decide," Stone added. "Either stop playing the philanthropist or leave the company. There's no middle ground." Edward walked to the window, looking at the city stretching out below him. Somewhere down there, Sophia was recovering from surgery. Helen was fighting against time to survive, and Maria was working tirelessly to keep her family together. And if I choose to leave, then you lose your executive rights, but retain your shares as a minority investor. Fisher consulted documents. You'd still be rich, Edward, just no longer the most powerful man in the room. Edward turned to face the 5 men who had been his partners for decades. "Do you really think I'll choose money over doing the right thing?" "We hope you'll choose sanity over madness," Robert Stone replied. 48 hours, Edward. Edward spent the next 24 hours in a state of emotional turmoil he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. He paced his penthouse apartment, past expensive paintings and designer furniture that suddenly seemed devoid of meaning. Every object around him represented years of decisions he now profoundly questioned. The phone rang insistently throughout the day. Lawyers offering legal strategies, consultants suggesting settlements, even some minor board members trying to negotiate an intermediary solution. Edward ignored all calls, except one. "Maria?" He answered on the first ring when he saw the hospital's number. "Edward, are you okay? Your voice sounds strange." Her genuine concern struck him like a dagger. When was the last time someone had worried about his well-being without financial interests involved? "I'm facing some complications at work." Edward sat in the leather armchair where he used to review financial reports. "How are Sophia and Helen?" "Sophia is recovering well. She's already asking to visit Grandma." Maria chuckled softly. "And my mother?" "Edward, since you paid for the new medication, she's much better. The doctor said her chances of a full recovery have significantly increased." Edward closed his eyes, absorbing the information. $43,000, a ridiculous sum compared to his fortune, had literally saved 2 lives. Meanwhile, his partner saw only misspent numbers on a spreadsheet. "Edward, are you still there?" "I am. Maria, I need to tell you something. Tomorrow, I'm going to make a decision that could change everything." "What kind of decision?" Edward looked out the panoramic window of his apartment, seeing the city he had helped shape through calculated investments. "A decision about what kind of man I want to be for the rest of my life." The next morning, Edward put on his best suit, the same one he had worn to the first board meeting 20 years ago. If he was about to burn bridges, he would do it with dignity. The meeting room was fuller this time. Besides the 5 board members, there were 3 lawyers, 2 auditors, and an accountant. Clearly, they had prepared for a legal battle, if necessary. "Edward," Fisher didn't even stand up when he entered. "We trust you've reached a sensible decision." "I have." Edward remained standing, refusing to sit. "I will continue to help the Santos family. I will continue to use company resources for projects I deem morally necessary, and I will begin to investigate all other families who were harmed by our business practices over the years." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert Stone was the first to speak. "So you've chosen madness?" "I've chosen humanity." Edward placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. "Something we lost a long time ago in this room." Fisher opened a new folder. "Very well, as discussed, you are being removed from all executive positions at Price Holdings, effective immediately. Your responsibilities will be redistributed among the board members." "Understood." You will retain 15% of the shares as a passive investor, but will no longer have a voice in operational decisions. One of the lawyers read from a document. Your access to corporate accounts is suspended, and all future transactions will require board approval. Edward nodded calmly. Anything else? Yes. Fisher smiled with cruel satisfaction. We expect you to immediately withdraw financial support from the Santos family. Consider it a final act of corporate responsibility. It was then that Edward felt something crystallize within him, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. No. Excuse me? I said no. I will continue to help them, but now with my own resources. Edward straightened up. 15% of this company will still yield me more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and I intend to use every penny to undo some of the damage we've done. Edward, you're committing financial suicide. Robert Stone tried one last time. I'm committing to moral rebirth. Edward walked towards the door. Gentlemen, it has been a distinct displeasure doing business with you. Leaving the building that had been his second home for 2 decades, Edward felt something unexpected. Relief. As if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. 3 days after leaving the company, Edward received a call that chilled his blood. Maria was crying on the other end of the line, her voice broken by desperate sobs. Edward, they're gone. Sophia and my mother. I can't find them. Edward dropped the coffee he was drinking, spilling the hot liquid over the papers scattered on his desk. He had spent the last few days organizing his personal finances and planning how to use his newfound freedom to help other families. Calm down, Maria. Tell me exactly what happened. I was at my night job, cleaning offices. When I got back to the hospital this morning, my mother wasn't in her room anymore. The nurses said a man came during the night with transfer documents. Medical transfer. Maria was struggling to breathe. They took her to another hospital facility, but nobody knows which one. And Sophia? She was with my mother at the hospital, sleeping in the chair beside the bed like she always does. Maria's voice broke completely. Edward, they took your daughter along with my mother, a 6-year-old child, and no one can tell me where they've gone. Edward felt a fury rising in his chest. Maria, where are you now? At the hospital. I'm trying to talk to doctors, nurses, administrators, but they all say they have no information. It's like they just disappeared. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. We'll figure this out together. 40 minutes later, Edward found Maria in the hospital corridor, sitting on the same bench where they had first talked about Helen. She was pale, trembling, her clothes rumpled from a full night of despair. I've spoken to 15 different people, Maria said, standing up when she saw him. Nobody knows anything. It's impossible for 2 people to just disappear from a hospital without a trace. Edward impulsively hugged Maria, feeling her tremble against his chest. He had never consoled a desperate mother and found that all his business experience hadn't prepared him to deal with raw human pain. We'll find out what happened, he said with a firmness he didn't feel. I have contacts, resources. We'll find them. Edward. Maria pulled away, looking him in the eyes. What if this has something to do with you? With your company, your family? What if someone took them to pressure you? The possibility had occurred to Edward on the way to the hospital, but hearing Maria verbalize it made it all more real and terrifying. Would his former partners be capable of something like this, using a child and an elderly woman as pawns in a corporate power game? No, Edward said, but his voice faltered. They're greedy and cold, but they're not criminals. Are you sure? Edward thought of the faces around the meeting table, the coldness with which they had described Sophia as a child who got hurt cleaning a floor, the calculated way they had orchestrated his removal from the company. No, Hissam admitted, I'm not sure about anything when it comes to them. At that moment, his phone rang. Unknown number. Edward Price? The voice was male, distorted by some kind of electronic modifier. Who is this? Someone who has two people very important to you, a 72-year-old lady and a 6-year-old girl. Both are fine, for now. Edward signaled for Maria to stay quiet, activating the speakerphone. What do you want? It's simple. You will stop investigating the past practices of Price Holdings. You will stop looking for other wrong families. You will stop trying to be a hero. The voice paused. And you will transfer your shares in the company to a trust we will specify. You're insane. This is kidnapping. This is business. You have 24 hours to decide. For every hour of delay, the ladies' and the girls' living conditions will deteriorate. If you hurt them. What will you do, Edward? Call the police? Explain how your personal crusade put an innocent family in danger? The voice laughed coldly. 24 hours. We'll await your call. The line went dead. Edward looked at Maria, who was as white as a sheet. My daughter, she whispered. They have my daughter. Edward took Maria's trembling hands in his. We'll get them back, I promise. How? You heard what they said. If we call the police. Then we won't call the police. Edward felt an iron determination settling in his mind. We'll use other methods. What methods? Edward looked at Maria, seeing Sophia in her desperate eyes, seeing Helen in her desperate courage. The methods I learned in 30 years of building a business empire, he said. Only this time, I'll use them for something that really matters. Edward activated a network of contacts he had cultivated over decades, but never for personal reasons. Private detectives, corporate security specialists, financial investigators, professionals he normally used to protect his investments, now worked to save 2 lives. In 6 hours, he had the answer he feared. The abduction had been orchestrated by a third-party security firm hired by his former partners. Not technically illegal, Helen had been transferred using falsified medical documents, and Sophia was officially accompanying her grandmother during treatment. They're in a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. Marcus, his lead investigator, showed satellite photos. Isolated location, discreet but efficient security. Technically, they're receiving adequate medical care. But they're prisoners, Maria said, her hands trembling as she held the photographs. Yes, and the only way to get them out is to accept the demands or... Marcus hesitated. Or, Edward asked, or use their own methods against them. Edward understood immediately. Blackmail. Exactly. You have information on them that could destroy their careers and fortunes. 3 decades of dirty deals, questionable contracts, wronged families. Marcus opened a laptop. I've gathered enough data to bury all of them, legally speaking. Maria looked between the 2 men. You're talking about corporate warfare while my daughter is scared somewhere. Edward knelt in front of her. Maria, I understand your desperation, but if we do this emotionally, we'll lose. We have to think strategically. Sophia is 6 years old, Edward. She doesn't understand strategies. That's exactly why we're going. To bring her back. Edward stood up, picked up the phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. Fisher? It's Edward. Edward. What a surprise. I imagine you're calling to accept our terms. I'm calling to make a counter-proposal. Edward activated the speakerphone for Maria to hear. You will release Helen and Sophia immediately, or I will publicly expose all of Price Holdings' questionable deals from the last 25 years. Silence on the other end of the line. Edward, you're bluffing. The Mendoza family, 1998. Home repossessed due to fabricated medical debts. The Oliveira family, 2003. Rental agreement with predatory clauses leading to illegal eviction. The Rocha family, 2007. Property bought during an artificially created financial crisis for 10% of its real value. Edward read from a list Marcus had prepared. Want me to continue? I have 43 documented cases. You wouldn't be able to destroy your own reputation. My reputation is already destroyed in my own eyes, Fisher. Now I'm just deciding if I take you down with me. Edward looked at Maria. And yes, I'd be capable of anything to bring a 6-year-old child back to her mother. Another silence, longer this time. What do you want exactly? Helen and Sophia back, unharmed, in 2 hours. In return, I'll maintain confidentiality about our past dealings and will not interfere with the company's operations anymore. And your shares? I keep my shares, but I promise not to vote against board decisions for the next 5 years. Edward paused. It's that or all-out war, Fisher. Choose. More silence. Edward could almost hear the calculations being made on the other end of the line. 2 hours, Fisher said finally. City General Hospital, main entrance. Fisher. Yes? If they are harmed in any way, the deal is off, and you'll find out what I'm capable of when I really want to destroy someone. Edward hung up and turned to Maria, who was crying with relief. They're coming back? They are. Edward hugged her again. And after this, we'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again. 2 hours later, in the parking lot of City General Hospital, Edward and Maria saw a black car approach. Sophia jumped out of the vehicle, running towards her mother, her colorful cast gleaming under the hospital lights. "Mommy, I knew you'd find me!" Sophia threw herself into Maria's arms. Helen got out of the car more slowly, supported by a nurse, but smiled upon seeing her family reunited. "Edward," Helen called as he approached, "thank you for bringing my family back." "Thank you for teaching me what truly matters in life," Edward replied, realizing those words were the purest truth he had spoken in years. 6 months later, Edward stood in front of the old corner diner, observing the transformation that had taken place in that space. The peeling walls now boasted cheerful pastel paint, the windows shone clean, letting in abundant light, and a new sign announced, "Helen Santos Community Center, Care, Dignity, and Hope." Sophia ran up to him, her arm completely healed, carrying a folder full of colorful drawings. At 7 years old, she had become the center's official artist, creating posters and decorations that brought life to the walls. "Uncle Edward, look what I drew." She opened the folder, showing a drawing of the family, Maria, Helen, herself, and Edward, all holding hands in front of the community center. "It's beautiful, Sophia. You're very talented." Edward knelt to her eye level, a gesture that had become natural over the months. "Mommy said you're going to make a speech today. Are you going to talk about how people can be good to each other?" "I'm going to talk about how people can help each other," Edward corrected gently, "and about how small gestures can change entire lives." The community center had become a reality, thanks to the dividends from the shares Edward still held in Price Holdings. 15% of the company still generated more than enough income to fund ambitious social projects. The irony was not lost on him. He was using money generated by the methods he now repudiated to undo some of the damage caused by those very methods. Maria appeared at the center's door, wearing a professional blouse with the center's emblem. In recent months, she had become the general coordinator of the project, overseeing a program that offered free medical assistance, job training, and emotional support for vulnerable families. "Edward, the first families have arrived for the official opening." She smiled, and he noticed how different she looked now, confident, fulfilled, with a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. "Helen is eager to meet the people who will benefit from the program." Helen, now fully recovered, had become the soul of the community center. At 73, she told stories to the children, advised worried mothers, and organized support groups for the elderly. Her personal experience with adversity made her especially effective in helping others find hope in difficult situations. "How is she today?" Edward asked, referring to Helen's health. "Better than ever. The doctor said she has the energy of someone 20 years younger." Maria laughed. "I think having a purpose did more for her health than any medicine." During the opening ceremony, Edward watched the dozens of families who had come to learn about the center's services. Children played in the garden Sophia had helped plan. Parents talked with social workers about job opportunities, and seniors participated in group activities coordinated by Helen. "Edward," a familiar voice called him. He turned to see Joe, the former owner of the diner, who now worked as the center's cook, preparing nutritious meals for the families served. "Joe, how are you settling in?" "Better than I imagined." The man smiled genuinely for the first time since Edward had met him. "You know, cooking for people who really need it gives a different flavor to the food. It's like every dish has more meaning." Edward understood exactly what Joe meant. In recent months, he had discovered that using his business experience to create something significant was infinitely more satisfying than simply accumulating wealth. When it was time for his speech, Edward stepped onto the small improvised stage in the center's garden. He looked at the expectant faces before him, families who had lost hope and were now finding it again, dedicated professionals who had chosen to serve rather than just earn money, children playing, unaware they were part of something revolutionary. 6 months ago, I walked into a diner to collect overdue rent, Edward began, his voice reaching everyone present. "I found a 6-year-old girl cleaning the floor with a broken arm, and I thought I was just seeing another problem to solve. Today, I understand I was seeing the solution to a much bigger problem, the problem of how we live with each other." He met Sophia's eyes, who was sitting on Helen's lap in the front row. "This little girl taught me that strength isn't about how much money you can accumulate, but about how many lives you can positively touch. That success isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the size of your impact on the community." Edward paused, feeling emotion welling in his chest. We all have the capacity to be the miracle in someone's life. Sometimes it's necessary to break down unjust structures so that something new and beautiful can flourish. And sometimes we discover that our true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we are able to give. The applause that followed was warm and prolonged. Edward stepped down from the stage and was immediately hugged by Sophia, who whispered in his ear, "Uncle Edward, you talk just like a prince from a fairy tale." "Why, Sophia?" "Because you learned that real treasure is making other people happy." Edward hugged the girl, looking around the community center that had blossomed where once there was only exploitation and despair. Maria approached and touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to start doing the right thing." As the sun set over the Helen Santos Community Center, Edward watched families leaving with smiles on their faces, children running through the garden, seniors sharing stories on the colorful benches. He had lost a business empire, but gained something far more valuable, the certainty that his life had purpose and meaning. Sophia approached him one last time before leaving with Maria and Helen, handing him a special drawing. A man smiling, in front of a colorful building with the caption written in crooked letters, "For Uncle Edward, who learned that being truly rich is making other people happy." Edward smiled, carefully placing the drawing in his inner jacket pocket. Some riches were more precious than any bank account.